Hi, folks. You're with Tacitus Today. Tacitus Today, your pushback channel. Thank you for joining this audio live stream. Please listen to this presentation as you would a radio broadcast. In this essay, I'd like to talk about the race relations in Vietnam during the Vietnam War. So I'm looking particularly at the period, say, 1966 to 1969, 70, around there. Now, if we look at movies that have been made since that time, whether it's the Forrest Gumps, the Platoons, whatever. What we see is what was shown is that race relations were pretty good. That every white soldier's bestest buddies were all black, and the intermingling of they all hang out together. They all do recreation together. They're sitting together, having their beers, contemplating the universe, and so on. Was that or is that an accurate depiction? Now, if you look at any sort of photographs, people taking personal photographs, not propaganda photographs. If you look at any of the photographs of the time, and say people take photographs of the men in their unit and this sort of thing, you see, certainly the ones that I've seen, you only see all white groups or all black groups. If you do see a white guy in there with the say black soldiers, then it's it's the lieutenant or the captain or the top sergeant or something like that who's the white guy with but and other than there's some propaganda photographs around where US soldiers are playing with kids or entertaining kids who are from an orphanage or something like that, Vietnamese kids, and then there's black and white together there. But that's clearly a propaganda sort of shot. But the reality is that the Vietnam War was the first American war where the soldiers were not officially and formally segregated. Did they self-segregate? Well, of course they did. The idea that they all hung around together as best buddies is just simply a fantasy. Now, maybe there were some. I saw the reason this has got to come to mind was I saw a couple of movies on a streaming service that I used. Saw a couple of Vietnam War movies, and one of them, the sergeants were all black, the doctors were all black, the munitions experts were all black, and the racist white people being put in their place by these, and all the black people spoke like they'd come out of Harvard University. And it was about as far from any reality as you can imagine. Again, pure propaganda. And the soldiers all looked like they just stepped out of the hairdressers, yet they're supposed to have been weeks out in the jungle. They didn't have a smudge of dirt on them. The uniforms were all neatly washed and pressed. Yeah, right. So anyway, looking at the times now, these are sort of. There's been quite a few race riots in the US. There's a lot of Soviet communist agitators running around stirring things up. There's the northeast of the United States in particular. Allen Ginsberg and and all those sort of people in the northeast. They're running around stirring things up as well. So race relations, race hustling, Marxist oppression type dialogue is all over the place. And so Martin Luther King's been assassinated, and the Vietnam War is deeply unpopular. It's expanding. It started off with relatively small numbers of US troops, and it's now become, as the 60s went on, or the later 60s, hundreds of thousands of more troops are being sent to Vietnam, and the conflict was widening and escalating, going out of Vietnam into the neighboring countries such as Cambodia. So it was certainly a time of many convulsions, not only in the region, Vietnam region militarily, but social convulsions in the United States. So let's look at the reality of the Vietnam War and the soldiers that were drafted, and then the narrative of race hustling and race grifting, because this is pretty important to understand it, because really we see it mirrored today. The narrative really hasn't changed that much. The idea of non-equal outcomes means equals as concrete evidence of oppression and racism and all that sort of stuff. That narrative still exists today. Back then, it was a fringe group sort of doing the race hustling, but today it's gone mainstream, which shows how valuable it was for the globalists to create social division. Nonetheless, let's come back to the Vietnam War. Now, when the war started, there was a lot of higher skilled operatives like Green Berets, that sort of thing, and they were almost exclusively white, and you had to have really a senior high school education was sort of or particular aptitude and superb health and fitness, these sorts of things. So the standards were pretty high for the Green Berets. Now, just for ordinary enlisted men, as the war expanded, they weren't all Green Berets being sent to the Vietnam region, as President John Kennedy was entertaining back in the early 60s, as they expanded from just thousands to hundreds of thousands of troops. They had to lower the standard. In fact, they had to introduce the draft. So they had to lower the standards. So really, it got reduced to, as long as you'd completed junior high school, you were considered good enough. Now, some of the equipment to be operated was reasonably complex, and you had different categories. For example, helicopter or jet pilots had to have a higher standard of education than, say, just infantry people on the ground just doing infantry grunt work. Then you had people to operate more complex machinery, and they needed more training, so it was viewed that they should have a higher level of education. So there were variants, within the recruitment sort of range of soldiers and war operative, Air Force, Navy, and so on, that were being recruited. So I'm looking more at just the straight grunts, as they were generically called. So white people had to finish, or people applying had to finish junior high school. Now, that was considered a minimum for being recruited into the armed forces. Now, the black activists and the race grifter hustlers in the day said, well, that's not fair, because very few black kids were finishing junior high school. They were kind of leaving, as soon as they could get out of school, which is usually at the end of the second year of high school, maybe early into the third year of high school. Then, a lot of these kids were leaving, black kids were leaving school and going off. Maybe they were working on the rural farm in the south, or maybe they're getting a job in a factory, or a chicken processing plant, something like that. So they were getting out of school as quickly as they could get out. So they didn't have junior high school education, or finishing junior high school education. So this was viewed that was racist. Look, more white kids are getting the job. Now, the reason this was an issue is that the pay for going to the Vietnam War was better than an entry-level labouring type job, which is what most of the black kids were getting to. Now, you still had to be 18 to go. So even though the black kids had left school at 14 or something, they still couldn't go to Vietnam straight away. But when they look at the pay that the army was offering, and so, there's quite a lot of black kids who were caught up in crime where they were offered a choice. Well, you can go to prison or go to Vietnam. So, some of those took that option. But the race hustling at the time was not fair. White kids are getting to go to Vietnam. The jobs pay better than a labouring job, and they're being denied to black people because they didn't finish junior high school. That's racist. That's fascist. The narrative. And so what the Defence Department government, I don't know where it would have come from, this movement, but they say, okay, well, you don't have to finish junior high school as long as you've got 3 years of junior high school instead of 4, which you have to complete junior high school. All you need is 3 years of junior high school, and then that's good to go. But even that wasn't enough. So the race hustling continued until they got 2 years of high school and will accept that. So they're accepting a lot of young black men who only had 2 years of high school, then had either hadn't worked at all or worked again on the family farm or some rural labouring job or whatever, or had been in and out of prison for various things, and they were the ones then going to Vietnam when they lowered it to 2 years, and this was done, of course, solely to create equality. Now, over the span of the war, depending on whose numbers you look at, actually, a bit of variance here, that the US black population was on or about 12%, and 11% of the soldiers, this is in Vietnam, were black. So it was, about in line with the population, but that wasn't considered good enough. And the race hustlers again came back and said, well, black kids, as they are overrepresented in the lower education level, should have a greater proportion of the soldiers going to Vietnam. And again, if you had say you got to be private first class, which a lot of black kids did, private first class in Vietnam, that job paid better than really any other job they would have typically been able to get. So it was a good job, money wise. I mean, people are shooting at you out there. Now, why the black race grifters would want black citizens to go to Vietnam to be shot at, and that was going to be equality, is a little bit beyond my comprehension. So I can only assume that their protestations that it was a well-paid, for black people, it was a well-paid job was it. They were thinking that, given it was in pay terms a desirable job, there should have been equal outcomes or something like that. Now, the race hustling split off into other areas as well. For example, black soldiers were, after 12 months service, black soldiers were more likely to re-enlist. And so they became, in proportion to their numbers, whereas black soldiers were re-enlisting at more than twice the rate that white soldiers were. So you had a high proportion of experienced combat infantry were black. So then the next sort of race hustling came when the black activists were saying, well, look at all the black kids, young black men that are out on frontline combat duty. This is going out on patrols and you're doing the stuff where you're going to get shot at by the North Vietnamese army and that sort of thing. So well, blacks are overrepresented there, and that's racism. Well, hold on, no. The policy is that you have the most experienced veteran combat troops that go out on these things. The veterans are less likely to make mistakes. They're more experienced. These sorts of things. So that's why there were more in proportion to the total of black soldiers in Vietnam. That's why there were more blacks there, because far more of them re-enlisted, and thus they became the most experienced frontline troops. And that's why they were there. But this was no. You're just sending young black men out to be murdered because you're a racist, fascist. So even the race hustling got into that. But notice here how in every instance they want it both ways. So we want more black people in Vietnam because it's better paid jobs, but we don't think they should be in frontline combat, even though they're the most, they've re-enlisted. I mean, if they didn't want to do that, why would they re-enlist? And these sort of things. Now, there are other claims that black people being offered sort of re-signing bonuses and things like that. I don't, because that narrative varies a little bit, not only the amount of money that was paid or if it's happening at all, or whether it was only happening in certain areas, such as frontline infantry and so on. So this idea of racism, I don't buy that. The blacks were hanging out together in their own groups. They would have their own corner of the bunkers or the mess rooms. They would, other than, the only time they would interact with white people really was through the sergeants and the officers and the senior sergeants at that. So now another area that the black race grifters claimed was an example of racism was that more black soldiers were being, through the military justice system, were being put in prison in Vietnam or wherever they were stationed. And that this again showed, because they were being imprisoned at 4 or 5 times whatever is the rate of white people. There it is, racism, fascism, Hitler at work again. Now this wasn't the Hitler thing wasn't a go back at the time, by the way, but it was more just straight out in that racism. And but the ratio of crime, black crimes versus white crime, whether it's in Baltimore or downtown Chicago with the drug gangs having shootouts, and it doesn't matter, wherever you go, in Africa or anywhere, then the ratio of violent crime was about the same. The ratio of black people being arrested in downtown Chicago, the ghettos and so on, being 4 or 5 times the rate of white people, and that was the same in Vietnam. It didn't change. Now this is in a very different environment where you're out doing on patrols and out on maneuvers and so on, and there are guys trying to shoot and kill you, and yet the black soldiers were, servicemen, were being, according to the army at least, committing crimes that, give or take, the same ratio as again they were in civilian life in the United States. So, I mean, that seems just too similar. So it must be related to behaviour. But then we look at the crimes that they were supposedly committing. They were the same sort of things that, it was the same sort of behaviour you would see in civilian life, even though they were, again, in a war zone, where you'd think the war zone factor would have caused a substantial change of behaviour, but somehow it didn't. And this I find odd. So the reasons that the black people, the black soldiers, the servicemen, were being imprisoned, dragged up on court martials, that sort of thing, where they were trying to kill each other. The blacks were killing each other and beating each other up, refusing to accept orders. Interestingly, they were more insubordinate to black, say, non-commissioned officers than they were to the white ones for some reason. So if a black sergeant said, "Hey, private, go and do this or that," they were more likely to tell the sergeant to get lost, than far more likely, from the looks of it, than they were if it was a white sergeant or a white officer. So they were also, things like falling asleep on watch, even though there were very strict rules on that, and going away without leave. Things that suggested a don't care or couldn't give a shit type attitude. And again, when you're in a situation where there are folks running around trying to shoot you, you need to be on the ball. While segregation was not a formal policy, it was the soldiers chose to congregate, and the officers and so on didn't push back against that. If a white unit, and again, as behaviour, if you look at the complaints from the units of white soldiers, they would claim that the black soldiers were unreliable, and so there was too much at stake out there, with, again, people trying to shoot and kill you. Too much at stake there to have somebody or people, or more than one person, who was unreliable. Whereas the black groups together, they would tend to argue and fight amongst themselves, which made them less reliable. So again, they had to be dispersed across white groups. So the various measures and efforts that were made to mitigate against what was seen as poor behaviour. Now the black casualty rate relative to whites, and again relative to the overall sort of population, if you will, of soldiers serving, that was deemed as higher. I'm not sure it was, but nonetheless, let's run with that for a moment. That again was cited as racism, and it was argued that in the most dangerous sectors where the enemy, the Vietnamese army was in operation, and there were lots of North Vietnamese soldiers around, that blacks were being sent into those areas and thus were suffering higher casualties. than white soldiers were. It doesn't seem to gel there. If blacks were suffering higher casualties, and that's a debating point, but let's again assume for the moment they were, was that due to their ineffectiveness and lack of preparedness, or were there other factors involved there? Because if you look at the sort of the writings and the documentation from the more senior officers at the time, if there was a key North Vietnamese military detachment, regiment or whatever, that was out there, and they wanted to destroy that North Vietnamese regiment, then they wanted to send the best, most effective, most capable soldiers there out, and they every time they chose white units to do that. So when it came to effectiveness, efficiency, combat efficiency, then it was they always turned to the white soldiers. So this idea that blacks were being unfairly, black soldiers and servicemen were being unfairly sent into the most difficult and dangerous war zones, I don't buy that. But that was the part of the race hustling and grifting going on as well. Then the next complaint was a complaint of racism was that blacks weren't being promoted to senior non-commissioned officers like senior sergeants or into officers and that sort of thing. So this was a little bit difficult to sort of take, because on one side the race hustlers and grifters are arguing that black kids with only 2 years of high school education that were, and if you look at the examinations, the minimum examinations that of standards for you must be literate because you have to read instructions that have been given to you, that sort of thing. The minimum level of education was done away with, so they lowered the standard until they were hiring people who were illiterate or functionally illiterate, and then the black kids, and then complaining at the same time that they weren't being promoted into the senior ranks of non-commissioned and commissioned officers. We can't have it both ways. You can say, well, you have to put illiterate black people in there, otherwise you're racist if you don't. And then say, well, why aren't they becoming officers? Why aren't they passing exams at the same rate of white people, given that the minimum standard for white people was at that stage at least, I think that may have changed too, was that they had to have completed junior high school. And typically for officers, they wanted kids who'd definitely completed senior high school and maybe had done some college as well. So the requirement for officers was a much higher level of education, which is understandable. And yet the race hustlers are saying, no, you have to hire black soldiers who are illiterate. So you find this sort of situation constantly when the race hustlers, they would want to have it each way, and well, why aren't you promoting illiterate blacks into officer positions? And if you don't, you're a racist. So looking at this, I don't know why the movies try to show a sort of a nirvana and a sort of racial camaraderie that never existed. Maybe it's nice to look back and think of the war that way, but the reality was quite different. And again, you only need to look at the photographs, and you can see all white units. There's one activist, movie maker or script writer, I think he might be, who tries to show this idea that all the blacks that were there were all doctors and generals and everything. And the white people were all racist Nazis and so on. And yet you look at the photograph, this guy had numerous photographs of himself when he was in Vietnam. He served there. And in every photograph in his photograph album is him surrounded by all white soldiers. There's not a black soldier in sight. And I'm thinking, why is he knows what the reality is, and yet he's trying to rewrite sort of racial history here. So that's a sort of summary of how they're trying to rewrite the Vietnam War and its racial makeup, and I can't see any evidence of anything other than the most minimal integration if at all. And bear in mind that these are all, for the most part, at least the grunts, as they generically called them at the time, probably still do. They were all, kids from small towns and places that that they had no sort of serious career aspirations, or very few of them anyway would, and nor did they seem to. If you look at sort of the way they describe themselves, they knew they were at the bottom of the socioeconomic pile, and so really serving in Vietnam was for them good pay. And for those, by the way, that wanted to turn it into something, there are opportunities to say learn a trade or something like that, or become a radio operator and maintain and operate the radio. There were opportunities there as well that the soldiers that had some ambition and get up and go could do and improve their situation, so that when they got back into civilian life, they could use those skills to gain employment in the private civilian sector. But the race hustling was just off the charts, and again they wanted to have it both ways, every way. But every time there was an outcome that wasn't one they liked, they even back then in the 1960s, they pointed that the only plausible cause was evil racism, when in fact it was nothing of the sort. You've been with Tassus today, your Pushback channel, and thank you for listening.